prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
che si impegna, che si batte,
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito del presente. E tutto questo
proporre con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting entitled The Gaze That Enlarges Humanity, Literature as an Experience of Reality. In 2024, Pope Francis wrote 2 letters on his vision of poetry and literature in a summary of his personal path. The first letter was published at the beginning of August 2024, and it deals with the role of literature in the education and in the growth of every man. The second one is a letter to poets. These 2 letters accompanied us in preparing this meeting, in the work that was carried out by cultural centers in presenting authors and books that we have at the book corner here at the meeting with the podcast live events. So literature and the way we listen to great author is a way to have a dialogue with the culture of our time. It opens up new interior spaces, and it gives voice to what we live, to what we desire, to what we dream of, because this literature helps us go beyond our borders, because sometimes indifference and individualism are limiting our selves. How many times do we notice how the words by a writer express better than we could what we actually feel? We are in a way read by the page we are reading. This is what represents us at best in what we lack and what we desire. Giussani defined Giacomo Leopardi an authority because he could express better than himself what he felt. So this is an authority that becomes a friend because we start to understand its reasons. Many times, Giussani read in the work of so many authors the attention to the search for the human image with words that are full of art and of genius and deal with the questions of the human conscience. So this actually helped us be more educated. Pope Francis says that literature is like a telescope, as Proust said, targeted at things that are necessary to understand the great distance created by everyday life between our perception and the human experience. Today, we have with us two voices of contemporary narrative, to teachers who have experienced the power of telling, and they write to improve themselves, to develop themselves, and to improve their relations with young people. So Paolo Malaguti is the first time at the meeting. Among his latest work, Sikuterat, the Mystery in Dialect, History of a Plain Faith. Fumana, that will be introduced tomorrow at the book corner, that was the great first work of Paolo Malaguti.
Eraldo Affinati,
Eraldo Affinati, who's he is well known to the public of the meeting. He has founded the school Penny Wirton, a free of charge school of Italian for migrants, and he has written Head, Heart, and Men and Hands. He has written The Man of the Future, On the Road of Don Lorenzo Milani, The Gospel of the Angels, and so many others. So welcome, Eraldo.
Allora, iniziamo questo.
So let's start this talk tonight with a question that I put to Paolo Malaguti. In your novels, you underline the linguistic tradition of your region, the Veneto region, and the importance of the family stories. You say that every one of us has a story. We should accept the risk of the tale because it is an act of love. So what do you think of the words of the Pope on the role of literature in our lives? First of all, good evening, and thank you. Thank you for this invitation. For me, as you said, it's the first time at the Rimini meeting, and I'm a bit worried, I must say, so I'm really honored. Thank you. Well, what you were saying is about the method that I have followed up to today to find new stories. And I must say that this method seems to work. Stories are very close one to the other. The narrative, or rather the material to write about, is not a problem because it is enough to look at things the right way. And we have the privilege and the responsibility to live in a region of the world where there is a great heritage in a linguistic and artistic story. And sometimes, however, we behave in a different way. We are almost ashamed of our dialect. To answer your question, in particular, in Pope Francis' letter on the relationship between literature and education, also priestly education, there are two aspects that really struck me and that I feel particularly close to. So I'll try to make some observations on these two words. And I'm a lover of writing on the one hand and a teacher on the other. The first word that comes as often in Pope Francis' word is the gratuity of the narrative act. I do believe that this is, in a way, a revolutionary theme. So when I started to teach my students how literature works, we often dwell upon these specific aspects. The narrative text is a communication act, something that is written for somebody, but it actually has to abide by different rules from, for instance, the instructions of a pharmaceutical product or a newspaper article. So there are three main elements, principles that characterized the artistic object or the literary texts. And one of these aspects is the suspension of the criterion of practical utility. When we read a novel, or when we listen to a song, or when we look at a painting, actually, we should feel some form of pleasure that is actually something that is enough in itself. So, well, when you give students something to read and then you have to test them on what they have read, this gratuity is no longer there because they don't read the work of art you've given them for their own pleasure. So this helps us, in a way, to remind our students that the practical functions of life will come in the future. They will have to work, they will have to earn money, they will have to have some kind of professional plans. But that's not all we have to do. The search for something beautiful has not to be linked with an economic or financial principle. Then there is another element, another word in the letters by Pope Francis is the relationship between literature and mystery. And I think that this takes us back to one of those ingredients that make up a literary text. And this is a technical word in a way, but it is something that actually all of us have experienced, that is to say, polysemy. So when you read, for instance, a text that is thought for a different culture than our own culture, like the Odyssey, we have something that resonates in us in a way. So we are not simply actually going back to something we already know, but we discover new things. So the literary text always reveals something new. It is a continuous source of mystery. And this happens, above all, in poetry, when there are very different texts, as for instance the poems by Montale, and I try to understand what the poet means, and so we have different ideas, different proposals. So this has another value that is an ethical value. It is a democratic value because if we know what the polysemy is, we start and understand we have to respect opinions that are different from your own. So if we today here should say what is the novel of their life, we would probably have 200 different answers, but everyone would be right. So these two aspects are, I believe, two extremely interesting elements in Pope Francis' letters. Thank you. Eraldo, in your life as an educator, what role does literature play? How can it help develop some images of life and in a way helps you being in a way a mean of cultural development? Good evening. Well, I must say that I have always believed that there is a strong link between literature and education. This is the reason why the words by Pope Francis really struck me, because from the very beginning, when I started with a book on Tolstoy, I have always had this double instinct, the literary one and the teaching one. Tolstoy was the greatest writer and teacher of our modern age. These two missions go hand in hand. Writing and teaching means sharing a common responsibility, the responsibility of the word, the written word for the writer, and the spoken word for the teacher. What does this mean? What does this responsibility of the word mean? It is not a legal concept. It's not a rule. It is something that is much deeper. When the teacher is in front of his students, has to take on the responsibility of the gaze of the way his students look at him. So it is a very clear difference between men and animals. And the writer is also linked to the experiences he has to pass on. So this is something I have found in the words by Pope Francis. Today we are facing an enormous risk, that is to say, the risk to be able to consider our words as free words that are not linked to a kind of feedback. We look at young people, at teenagers, and they are well, they think that they can do and dream and think whatever they want. But the educator has to make his students understand that we cannot dream, think, and be whatever we want. There is a moment when you have to make a choice between many different options. And this choice has to be made. So literature, Pope Francis says, is a help in this choice. He had this element very clear in his mind, the element of the discernment. War and Peace by Tolstoy, which I read as a young boy. I didn't have any teacher, so I read alone. At the time, I knew I could be Pierre or I could be Andrei. I could identify in one character or in another one. Great writers ask that you take a position. So this is the crucial element of today's literature. Take a position means to give up something, and this is not easy. It is always very painful to give up something that you could have done for something in which you believe. So we need adults that can actually embody choice. They can have to be people who have chosen a certain path. Literature teaches us that freedom doesn't mean to go beyond any limit. It means that we accept our limits. And this is a path in terms of sentimental education that young people today, have problems in accepting. The digital revolution seduces them. It's a kind of addiction in a way. Somehow, young people are always open to anything that can arrive. So some reflections by Pope Francis make us bring literature back to its educational dimension that helps you grow, that helps you become something that you maybe already are. So, Augustine with his own concept of interior teacher makes us understand that there is a fire inside any teacher. The teacher is capable of seeing the future in the eyes of his students. Thank you. Thank you, Eraldo. Well, you both had a faith experience that is extremely important for you, that for which you are very grateful. Paolo Malaguti with Azione Cattolica, the camps in Valpostoria, Eraldo Affinati in meeting Don Lorenzo Milani. So I would like to ask you about Eric Auerbach, who says that thanks to the gospel, a new realism was introduced in literature, because with Christianity a new value was given to the concrete aspect of everyday life. So what is, in your eyes, the link between the concreteness of Gospels and the capability of your works to unveil what is human in in all of its depths? Yes, I must say that I was really lucky to meet, maybe not, so to speak, voluntarily, in a church, a Franciscan church, and I was an educator there, and I thought that maybe I could have tried my hand at teaching. What I didn't like at the time, when we had the spiritual retreats, there was a moment when you had to read the gospel. I thought it was very useless, and there was a bit a shame, because I thought that it was not really something you should do. I didn't talk about this with my friends at school. I didn't talk about the fact that I owned my own gospels. Well, I was wrong, obviously. And actually, I gradually understood that one of the reasons this activity looked useless to me was that I had the presumption that I knew these tests already. But that is wrong, obviously, because, yes, I had heard I had listened to the Gospels at the church, at Mass, but I had never given attention to these texts. So I did study these texts, maybe not with the same passion with which I read Greek poems, Latin poems, whereas here I could find that this kind of reality was closer to me, in spite of 2,000 years of time gap. So, well, I felt this kind of emotion, this closeness, but I could not really interpret it. And it was only when I was at university that I read Mimesis by Auerbach. And I understood his analysis, which is what you were asking about. In the chapter in which Auerbach talks about the power, the revolutionary power of the text of the Gospels in the Mediterranean area, in redefining the representation of reality, he gives an example from Matthew's Gospel, the chapters about the Passion of Christ, when Peter stops in the courtyard of the most important priests, and when he is asked, "Are you one of the disciples?" he says no 3 times. In Matthew's test, at the 3rd time, Peter denies being a disciple. His accusators say, the way you speak denounces who you are. Today would say your accent, your dialect shows who you are. So this is actually the first time Auerbach says that we have a text that has a double revolution. It goes beyond, so to speak, the moral and physical exceptionality of the classic characters, the extraordinary events, and it takes us to a very normal context, a courtyard, and it makes even us see that there are dialects and accents that characterize the way of speaking of the people. So this is something completely new. And I believe that in order to find a test of the classical literature that can be equally realistic, you have to go back to the Satyricon by Petronius. According to a way of interpreting this test, is a test that is a presumption of the Gospels. So Petronius probably knew or had read somehow some tests on the life of Jesus. So maybe this is why it becomes such a revolutionary text. Now, well, Gospels in a way then created a dramatic change in the Western imagery. This happens because we understand now why we still read novels today and why novels have developed as a genre so much in the Mediterranean civilization. So the element is that of the centrality of man. When I try to explain the fundamentals of a narrative text, I say that it is a text where there is someone that does something, and that's it. So, well, for a text to be a narrative text, there has to be someone who acts. At the center of the novel, there are then people who do things, who act. The centrality of people mirrors the centrality of man in the Christian message, not only as man that becomes God and God that becomes man, but also in the dignity of a fisherman that, in a way, does not acknowledge his own master for 3 times. So this reinforces our responsibility to put human dignity at the center of our stories. When we tell our stories, we put men and women at the center, and we talk to men and women who will then read our stories. At the center of the Christian message, there is a narrative dimension. There is, in a way, a revolution of human dignity, and this is a very good way to read this. And then there is another aspect which I find always very interesting, that is to say, in Christianity, we don't have just one sacred text. We have 4 Gospels, 4. So the same story is told 4 times. It's some kind of challenge in a way. So it's a way to say the word is not our idol. The same story can be told with different words, because what is more important is the centrality of man.
Thank you very much. You gave me the chance to understand the depth of some of your novels even better. I can now better understand the complexity and depth of some of your personalities, Eraldo. Well, Auerbach's realism that was inaugurated by the Christian Revolution is, in my view, connected to the quality of human relations affirmed by Christianity. When Jesus, for the first time, goes to the Tiberiade Lake from Capharnaum, he meets some fishermen. The gaze between the two is not a, so to say, rewarding one, as oftentimes still today is the case today. But that's basically without any reward, without any expectation. It produces a gesture well before producing an expectation. So the fishermen follow Jesus. So you have this fishermen following Jesus, and that's the very inception of Western civilization. If we hadn't had the Gospels, probably not even the Great Russian Revolution would be as it was afterwards. So the quality of human relations as something gratuitous, as something free, is, in my view, the distinctive element, the characterizing element of Christianity. And in this respect, the whole literature was impacted. The whole Western literature was impacted by this gratuitousness. I think that we are all, in a way, called upon by this. And this is something that I've always felt in my activity as a trainer. In other words, this special gaze. When we teach Italian to children, to young people coming from all over the world, when they are dealing with a volunteer, they immediately understand that the volunteer are doing this for free. In other words, the volunteers are teaching them verbs or words or terms or word order for free. And when they understand that they're doing that for free, those unaccompanied minors or the refugees or women with children, and actually most of the times you don't know who the father is. I mean, all of these people applying to us are touched. They wonder why these people are doing this, because they understand that these people are doing that for free. They might wonder why these people are taking care of them. I think this aspect can still today make the difference in the action and in the life of everybody. I always remember that at the Città dei Ragazzi, that's the name of a community that is in the outskirts of Rome, that was founded by an Irish priest who would take care of the Shusha, the abandoned children after the Second World War. And when I joined that community, most of them were migrants, but there were also Italian children coming from the outskirts, coming from the peripheries, and many of these children would be on drugs. They were always borderline. And once we called a health professional and asked him to explain to our young people what risks they were facing. And we asked him to do this professionally. He did the job, and he worked using brainstorming. So he used the blackboard, he invited all students to participate. And then at the end of his presentation, he talked to these young people and asked, do you have any questions? And nobody answered, as if that class would be useless. And then there was a guy who had a brain injury, and he raised his hand. And I will always remember the gaze of the teacher, of the trainer, who was a bit puzzled because she didn't know what this guy was going to ask. And so this guy raised his hand and said, do you really love me? This was his question to him. And we were all speechless. We understood that actually this guy with the brain injury had, in a way, hit the target. I mean, he had shown everybody that that person who had been called to report the risks of drugs had been a professional, but he was not involved. He was not truly involved, and that guy actually felt that, and that's why he asked, do you really love me? That is something that will always come to my mind when I think of a gaze that should be able not to be instrumental vis-a-vis people. This is, of course, something that doesn't come from instinct. That depends on our culture. I mean, that's a cultural relationship. You have to establish that kind of relationship. You have to work with yourself and in yourself to be able to be that free in your relationship with the others. And that is why I believe that Christianity should be reinvented constantly, every day, every hour. This renewal should happen at a linguistic level. This is what Pope Francis, in my view, had stressed in his letters. I mean, we need to implement a renewal of the religious language, especially when we talk to young people. Otherwise, we run the risk of losing them. And this risk is higher and stronger today than yesterday. Our language has to be legitimated by our life, by our experience. Otherwise, our words run the risk of being sterile. Thank you very much, Eraldo. So when talking about tangible gestures, the tangible gestures that you propose with this gratuitousness, can you please tell us your experience and actually the pathway that you followed on the St. Francis path with your young guys? I mean, I happened to be on tour from Milan to Rome, following the line of the St. Francis way, and I did a lot of steps, and I basically called on the various Penny Wirton schools from Milan to Tuscany to Rome, to Latium. And that is because I wanted to follow the content of a letter that two African children had with them in 1999. They were found dead at Brussels airport. They actually had hidden in the airplane, and they were asking basically to the powerful of the earth for food, healthcare, and education. And after many years, these requests have not been fulfilled. So I wanted to go back to that letter and wanted to redraft it with the words of the migrants I met along the way. We brought it to the Vatican, and a couple of days ago, the Pope officially replied. And when we were traveling, that was the moment between one Pope and the other Pope. And so we happened to be in the monastery of Cellule in Tuscany, so near San Gimignano. And I will always remember when the monks told us about the newly elected Pope and the first words spoken by Pope Leo, with his words talking about a disarming and disarmed peace. And those words were really helpful for us. They really supported us in the following parts of the journey. And in that journey, I truly realized that we have to have the courage to pronounce old words, the old words spoken by our fathers that we are so wary, so scared to pronounce again. Those are the words that the two migrants have given to us: peace, fraternity, brotherhood, love, justice. We are afraid to utter these words. But as Ibrahim, Rajdu, Francisca have spoken them again, I mean, I perceived them as truly true words. Thank you. Thank you very much. So in the letter to poets, Pope Francis said that the artist is the eye, the voice, and the gate. So the man who looks with his eyes dreams and imagines a world that isn't there yet, and he forges the spiritual imagination of people in our time. And for these three things, he basically said that the artist carries a great responsibility. What is your reaction when thinking about these definitions of the writer, and how do you live, how do you experience this invitation to responsibility as a service towards the whole of mankind? Paolo. Well, I would say that out of the three definitions, actually, this is the definition of the artist as a person, the person who looks at the world, but at the same time who dreams of another world at the same time. Dreams should not be conceived as an escape from reality. Of course, I mean, we have different genres in literature. They're all legitimate, but I think that literature should not be confined in simply writing about flowers and green meadows and nice pets and animals. Writers have a responsibility, and their responsibility is the responsibility of dreaming. In other words, we need to be strong enough to kind of outline a project, to give meaning to the world where we live, also through stories that take place in different times. So the artist is a man who dreams in the sense that he looks beyond, who plans, who's looking for a sense, and this sense has then to be given to his readers. A friend of mine who's a literary critic, and who was the first one who reviewed my novels, once pointed out something, and I think he was right. I mean, he told me that actually the characters in my novels do not make any evil. They are protagonists who tend to do good, and I couldn't but agree. I thought about the reason why, and I think I've given myself an answer. When I write, still today, and probably I'm doing this automatically, I'm applying a double filter. The first filter is actually what my grandmother from the mother's side, the grandmother I've lived more when I was a child, what she could have thought if she had read these novels. So the perspective of one of the most important persons who educated me. And the other filter is actually what my students would think if they read these pages. This I hope they can read something else and not only what I try and read. But apart from that, I think that it is indeed possible, maybe also right, that art tries to return young readers a possibility, an opportunity, the opportunity that kind of shows a direction in the future. Eraldo before talked about very difficult stories of a mankind that, in spite of the difficult years that we live, to be forgotten. I teach in Bassano del Grappa in a lyceum in the Veneto region, and I deal with students who are, from a socio-economic point of view, in an advantaged position, but oftentimes we fear this sort of cynicism, even if they're so young, 16 or 17 years old, and we have to feel responsible for that. You have some people aged 17 years old, and they tell us, well, actually, we know how things go. Things will never change. That means that if they say so, something has gone wrong. And in this respect, I think that literature and art in general can play an important function, because they can actually propose many different interpretation cases and open up whole new worlds. This, of course, may lead us to the arbitrary field of individual tastes and opinions. I cannot but dislike, as a reader, a kind of literature that is well represented in the editorial field. So a kind of literature which relies too much on pain as an end in itself. That's basically shows too much the problems, the functional problems of relations. And this kind of literature doesn't make any step forward. It doesn't try, I wouldn't say to censor the evil, but rather it should try and look at the evil, trying to accept the challenge that humanity has to give itself a sense. It should try and basically convey the meaning that in spite of the evil, in spite of the bad things that happen, still my life can have the possibility to make projects, to make plans. If we look at the big names of literature, Victor Hugo, Manzoni, Dostoevsky, there's lots of bad things, there's lots of evil things there. But they don't stop there. They go beyond. They try and go beyond. Of course, that's not easy. But as a teacher, we have to say that. In other cases, it's very difficult to try and combine our activities as writers and that of teachers. Oftentimes, I tell my colleagues that we're paid by the state to be optimistic. Through literature, we should always give our students, our pupils, the key to access their keys of meaning. We shouldn't condemn them to be cynic. We shouldn't close them the doors and leave them with the image of the evil winning over the good. I think that's wrong. Eraldo? So responsibility, the responsibility of the artist is a thorny issue. Clearly, we all realize that we cannot expect from art to prescribe what's good and what's bad. Art goes much deeper than that. It talks to you well, it addresses you well beyond the regulatory frameworks where it is shaped. If you take the Karamazov's Brothers by Dostoevsky, that's some kind of an underground novel. Oftentimes we look at this big novel as a story of the killing of a father, and we believe that the great novel has only been an exercise to delve deep in humans' evil aspects. But that novel also shows a light, the light that is inside the evil that Dostoevsky talked about. And as a matter of fact, the novel ends with some kind of a pedagogical hymn with Alyosha, one of the protagonists, who goes to the funeral of one of the dead children and kind of is capable of creating harmony again among his old enemies. So that novel is at the same time is evil, but at the same time it also indicates your way to salvation. So I think that literature is the intensification of life. It helps you intensify your life. It cannot give you any easy answer. But to reach that, you need to guide, to lead the reader to, in a way, find himself, to personify himself in literature. I found the exchange with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a theologist against Hitler, and this exchange with him was very useful for me. He has experimented, he has experienced this aspect very well. So Lutheran priest that was hung by Hitler's Nazist forces, and he experienced this very deep tension of the fighting Christian, the combatant Christian, when his disciples approached him and asked him, how can you manage? How can you be a Christian and how can you be a combatant at the same time? So somebody who's fighting, who was not is not looking at history from the outside, and this person, as an artist, as a theologist, as a Christian, he replied by saying, "Look, if I saw on the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, and if I saw a mad killer killing passers-by, and this was a clear allusion to the Führer, my first duty as a priest would be to, in a way, kind of stop the taxi, the mad driver. So that sentence by Dietrich Bonhoeffer can be our own, could have been spoken by everybody. So we have the ultimate reality, and we don't know anything of the ultimate reality, but we're called upon to react here and now as men, as human beings, before, well before then being as artists. Actually, artists are men, are human beings. They're not different than any other man. And so we have to kind of take a stance. We have to adopt an opinion. We have to, have our hands dirty. We have to put our hands in the action. We have to get wounded and get injured. We cannot think that we can preserve an immaculate conscience. So history is asking you to take a position. And actually, writers and teachers perceive this appeal, this deep appeal, to really have a hands-on approach. So with their thoughts and in the daily reality, we cannot but follow our responsibility as artists. And in my view, therefore, we have to reject the idea that art is detached from life, that art has to pay the price of kind of providing some kind of a refund if it makes damages. Lots of masters of the 20th century have induced us to think this way, but I don't think that's the way we should go. Half an hour ago, I was visiting the exhibition, a very wonderful exhibition on Vasily Grossman, and I was I had a very nice guide to the exhibition. Actually, that artist paid his price, and this kind of artist can be very useful. He was a Ukrainian, but he had served in the Red Army, and in the end he distanced himself from that. I mean, that was a kind of an artist who questioned himself. He got wounded, and he gave us the real word. Thank you. I have a very, very last question to our guests. In your individual pathway, what works of art have been most instructive to you and basically helped you develop, access your deepest meaning and experience reality, which is the most central concept of Pope Francis' letter on the value of literature? When I think of my individual reading pathway, I risked a lot, I have to say. I risked to kind of stop at the very beginning, because I am the basically younger brother of an elder sister, and my elder sister has always read a lot. So basically, I've always grown up with my parents telling me, look at your sister, she's so good, she reads so much, you have to read as well. I've also tried to read what she read, so Wuthering Heights, for example, Jane Eyre, and I couldn't but understand how a novel that could have been closed in 3 pages. I mean, if everybody said what they thought, for example, do you like me? Will you marry me? Okay, yes or no. I mean, it would be closed in 3 pages. There have been 3 main steps in those years. So So the Treasury Island, that was the very first novel where I was deeply immersed and I was amazed and did not get bored and I wanted to go on. So Stevenson was definitely my first meeting. Then second step, at the beginning of my university years, Don Quixote. I remembered that novel very much because there was a type of reading. Because of the type of reading, it was very long. I would spend afternoons reading, and I would be immersed in the novel. And so you had this effect that you do not dominate the novel. You have basically forgotten the beginning. You still don't see the end, so you are being guided by the novel. And this leads me to reflection. Oftentimes, publishers are happy if they see that your first draft is between 250 and 300 pages, so that the average reader is not discouraged to read. Apparently, average readers have difficulties in reading longer books. We always have the temptation to look at our smartphone or at our emails. So longer books are now not so much appreciated. And then the third step, probably the most recent book I fell in love with, was Libera no San Amado by Menegallo. That was the book that I really liked a lot because it enabled me to basically rethink my family language. I was not taught dialect, and so reading Menegallo enabled me not so much to recover, but rather to, try and reapproach the code, the dialect spoken in my family, because that can be a very powerful starting point for our writing style, if we like writing. Thank you very much, Eraldo. Well, I could mention lots of books, but I'd like to remember the books, to recall the books which were instructive, who were educational for me, and which I then shared with my students in class. So, books that, in my view, are evidence of the strength of literature. So, literature that has not motivated myself only, but through my passion, it could be, in a way, diffused to the children I was teaching. So, in a suburb of Rome, I was teaching in a middle school, and that was at the beginning of my career. I started reading the Ricordanze by Giacomo Leopardi, and I asked a young child, basically, I remember how these young children were fascinated and really enlightened by listening to the nice words by Leopardi. They were really puzzled, fascinated, and looking at them, I said, well, probably Leopardi can be brought to these people. It can be useful to everybody. Or the I Malavoglia by Verga. At this community, La Città dei Ragazzi. And it seemed to be very difficult for us Italians as well, but some Afghan children were also fascinated. They were happy. So I once asked Afiz, why? Isn't this book difficult for you? Why are you getting so fascinated by the story of this family of fishermen from Sicily? And he told me, well, actually, the proverbs of the old Antonia are like the ones spoken by my grandfather in Kabul. And it was in that moment that I understood the universal power of literature that is capable of speaking to everybody. Or, for example, when you're dealing with an ordinary class, and I was presented and I introduced Il Sergente nella Neve by Mario Rigoni Stern. And I had the chance of actually knowing the writer, and I realized that I had two guys in my class, and their grandfather, one from Moldavia had his grandfather being in the Red Army, and the other one had served in the Italian Alpine Army. So we were talking about two grandsons of two soldiers who presumably might have met. And so when I discovered that, I invited these two students to kind of sign peace, and they did that. So they were solemn in making peace. And I realized how literature can be a written page, but also real flesh, living flesh. Thank you very much. Thanks to our dear guests for the wealth of contributions. Our humanity is not formed without the direct competition with narrated stories. Literature opens the mind and helps the formation of peace and enables us to experience reality. Thanks to literature, we can really say that reading and literature in general and poetry are breaks that we can offer to the whole world and to ourselves. I would like to invite everybody to support the Rimini meeting. Thanks to the counters of the Dona Ora, Donate Now. Thank you very much and enjoy your meeting.
Questo è un luogo che genera dialogo,
Che si impegna, che si batte.
che approfondisce la conoscenza e sostiene la fiducia. È un crocevia dove si incontra chi desidera il vero, il bello, il giusto e il bene. È una testimonianza di speranza nel cuore ferito, del presente. E tutto questo
Con la propria vita.
esiste anche grazie a te.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.
Vi prego, vi imploro, con umiltà e con fiducia, permettete a Cristo di parlare all'uomo.
Don Gius aveva capito il problema che avevo. Se la tua vocazione è vero, il tuo lavoro verrà fuori anche dai sassi.
Di comunicare la fede agli altri, ma veramente insieme a loro riscoprire che cos'è la fede, che cos'è la fede per me. Portare Cristo agli altri, comunicarlo agli altri è l'unico modo che abbiamo per conoscerlo veramente.
L'iter communionis aiuta a comunicare all'esterno la ricchezza di vita, di giudizi, di tentativi, di opere che nascono dalle persone e dalle comunità. L'iter communionis è proprio la vita del movimento. Scrivete all'iter communionis le vostre esperienze, ci fate bene.